I would like to introduce Martin. He'll describe the dedicated push towards improving healthcare treatments with semantic technologies and data-centric thinking at its core. He'll be very candidly offering up what it takes to keep things rolling. And I think I've heard you before refer to this as a fight. So, consistently and constantly communicate the value and achieve, domain, enterprise, and equally important, more, pharma community buy-in. So please do elaborate on your introduction, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve, for kicking this off. I'm Martin Romacker. I work here in Basel, by the way, Switzerland, not Sweden, but both starts with an SW, in Roche Pharma Research Early Development. And I have to say, I have been on this journey about semantic technologies also for quite some time, at least 2 or 3 decades. Also meeting people like Steve and others quite a while ago at the Semtech conferences down in San Francisco. And I would like to talk about moving towards true data centricity, and also what are the capabilities that you need to build within your organization for a really true fair implementation. So I'm reflecting here a little bit on the pharma healthcare perspective. But I would like to kick this off with a little bit more kind of a business perspective, why we're looking into this and what you want to achieve. And I would like to start with a slide that I owe Rick van Bruggen from Neo4j, looking into the megatrends that we're having in digital transformation. And I think all of them will look very familiar to you, starting with data-driven drug discovery, personalization. As you may know, in healthcare, personalized healthcare is a very, very important topic. Then, of course, you would like to use our data assets to drive enhanced decision making. We're looking into massive data integration, 360-degree views of compounds, for example, that we have in our libraries. And last but not least, the most prominent one, maybe, for which you get quite easily some support, AI and machine learning. I think there is a little bit of bias looking into these digital transformation trends, because all of them heavily depend on fair, high quality, and connected data at the core. And this is something which is sometimes a little bit neglected. And I think we really have to also emphasize in our organizations that we have to make a huge investment here to make our data fair, high quality, based on semantic technologies, to be able to really get the value out of the mega trends that we're currently working on. In order to do so, we have to look into data standards, like coming in terms of terminologies, semantic metadata, dataset models and ontologies, which we also have crafted the term fair plus Q, so fair data plus data quality. But everything which is in this realm really ties you in the world of semantic technologies. Also, reflecting a little bit on data as an asset, I think that's a very interesting topic, because when we create data assets, there are costs associated to creating this data asset. In our specific case, for example, we need to, when we run an assay, for example, we have the FTEs, the people working in the lab to create this data asset. We have to procure material like sample, reagents, compounds, and last but not least, infrastructure. These are the instruments, the machines on which the assays run, but of course also IT. Now that's the first part. So we're having here expenses to create a data asset. But later downstream, there are a lot of unplanned and invisible costs associated to the data assets that we are generating. So we have to perform some reasonable degree of business analysis to understand what data assets we have created. We have to search and access the data. We have to clean it. Also working on data curation, setup, ETL processes, semantic data integration, and last but not least, also the IT infrastructure and the FTE to support these unplanned activities. And this creates huge expenses. And the root cause of these kind of unplanned and invisible costs really can be seen in the lack of semantic interoperability. And in order to illustrate a little bit how we are working with data as an asset, some people also say data is the new oil of the digital economy, try to find a kind of a metaphor. And then I run into the oil industry, where I learned that every year 150 billion cubic meters of gas are just flared as a byproduct of producing oil or getting oil out of the soil. Well, this is a huge waste of resources. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, working in various industries and also creating constantly new data assets with our various business processes, how many of these data assets vanish every year forever or are poorly usable just because we don't have a decent data management in place? So at least in the pharma industry, we of course want to be data centric. We foster industry 4.0. We want to be we want to digitize our business. So data is considered as being an asset, but we do not treat it as an asset. On a side note, also looking into this from an economic perspective, I think one of the reasons is that, at least so far in most industries, possibly not so much in the digital world, but in most of the industries, we don't put data on the balance sheet of our company's organization. So you have a cost associated to data, so there must also be a value, otherwise you wouldn't create that data. And then if poor data management or if the violation of data quality KPIs has an impact on your data, you could have an immediate amortization on the value of your data. And then all of these hidden costs would become visible, and eventually people would start to work differently with data. Looking into the way, more from the high level economic perspective, we work with data into something that we have been working on, and is also a kind of a personal, say, vision or ambition I'm having is looking into a way, how can we procure information into our data-driven data management value chain? Also getting rid of many of the data integration layers that we have and all the expenses related to those. And again, you might experience I'm a very metaphoric guy. I found another analogy. Let's take a look at the aircraft manufacturing industry. And I apologize that I've taken here Airbus and not Boeing, but I just wanted to find a good example. So the aircraft manufacturing industry shares a lot of commonalities with, say, the pharma industry. It is a highly complex product. We have highly distributed processes. We also have vertical integration, like, for example, the engines that are used in airplanes are manufactured by external companies like Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, and other ones. And then here comes the miracle. So Airbus globally has 4 assembly lines, one of them being in the USA, France, Germany, and China. And now all of these parts come together, they assemble the aircraft, and everything fits. And my experience working with data, whenever I get data in my data projects that I have to bring together that come from 2 different repositories, from 2 different sources, more or less nothing fits. Just because, as a general theme, we don't look into semantic interoperability so much. But the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, are data-driven data management information assembly processes really different from assembly processes in manufacturing? And this has led me to the idea of, can't we procure information into our data-driven processes and knowledge-based processes the same way how we procure spare parts or physical parts in manufacturing? So I would define information procurement is based on 2 parts. It's information architecture, where we have an information-centric data organization with semantically sound and meaningful data coming in terms of ontologies. And then information procurement is the effective and efficient process of creating, acquiring, and integrating standardized information types into information-driven R&D activities. And standardized, again, goes back to the way how we manage our data standards using semantic technologies. And that's what I'm going also to outline a little bit more in this presentation. Looking into our industry, which is outlined by medicine, chemistry, and biology, we have a wealth of standards. So we have a portal which is maintained by the University of Oxford, which is called Fair Sharing, where you can see all the various standards that are available to drive any kind of, say, standardization in our organizations, from discovery until marketing. But the issue is we have too many. So currently on Fair Sharing, you find that's an older slide where we had 1,300 entries. Now we have 1,650 entries, which illustrates that our standards are still proliferating. So we still proliferate and fragment standards, which at the end of the day makes our task to really procure information into our processes more difficult. And this is, for those of you who are in the healthcare industry or in the pharma industry, an example, but it's very easy to understand and to read, because I have taken here two different standards. One is coming from CDISC. Just as a background, when you make a submission to the healthcare authorities, the submission of your data in the CDISC standard is mandatory, so you cannot submit something to the FDA without following the standard. And ODC, OMOP, this is another standard which is more related to clinical data, so-called real-world data that we can get out of the out of hospital information systems, for example. On the left side, this is more the controlled environment in clinical trials. On the right side, these are the data that emerge when patients are hospitalized and you submit them to specific treatments. What you see here on the left side is the description of a patient in CDISC, which is coming here as a so-called demographics domain. And on the right side, you have the ODC patient model. And as you may see also from the data and metadata elements describing those entities, in essence, these two standards talk about the same entity or the same domain, if you wish. They just name it differently. And then when it comes to the descriptions in terms of data or metadata elements like study identifier, age, date, time of birth, the race, the sex, the biological sex, you see that the way how this is represented is completely diverged. For example, the unique subject or patient identifier here uses as a data element person underscore ID, and here it's called use subject ID. So this diversity of standards and this missing semantic alignment, this missing semantic interoperability really blocks the creation of insights and analytics, because every time you want to integrate data, you have a larger data integration and migration project. We're also using ontology-based approaches in various contexts. And I would just like to give you an example of what we want to achieve as a community here. For those of you who are not on the biomedical domain, so here you see a description of a scientific description of a bioassay on the left side. And what we are trying to do when we apply semantic technologies to the data we're having, we want to represent everything by using available ontologies, semantic resources. Here, for example, we have been using the bioassay ontology, and both the data elements, the properties, and the values are being represented using semantic standards. So this is the to-be state that we're aiming at. We also here are part of the of pre-competitive collaborations with other pharma. So this is something that has come into being in the Data4E project, and this is a project where we team up with other pharma. And the idea is to make these annotations that we have harmonized and standardized publicly available. So we also see this as a pre-competitive task and not something that we have to solve individually in our organizations. So now looking into the topic more closely, also from the Roche perspective, what we're aiming at is, or the vision is, to create an open public private semantic infrastructure of fully standardized fair application services and data. And I think the Data Ferry project is an example of what we may want to achieve. And looking into the daily work we're having, this is the reality. And it's an example from a project I was working on. So in essence, we have been receiving data from 8 different data providers that talk about a molecule. So that's a structure, chemical molecule we're working in. And you describe, for example, what is the molecular target it is aiming at. And what is quite interesting is that all of these 8 different systems had a complete different representation of describing these molecules with the metadata around the molecular target. And what is the issue here? I mean, you see some examples. You have free text. You have sometimes you have the same field, but they have a completely different value domain. Or in a description, you're using coordination. So you have an inhibitor of a specific molecule, and then you also see inhibits KIT, RET, MET, and FLT3. This is extremely difficult to deal with. So what do we have to do? So we have to work on data curation, which creates inevitable additional costs. So we put here about 18 person months to clean up the data. It also creates inevitable project delay. So we had to wait for the data because we were working with multiple people on it for about 5 months. Then, of course, you misallocate resources because many data scientists do this kind of task, but they should focus on insights and not on data crunching. Sometimes you have information loss because you cannot recover all the information. And last but not least, as I mentioned before, the creation of insight is really impacted if you don't have semantic modeling principles in place. So you also fail on really the data monetization. What we have crafted within Roche Genentech is a model that helps us to introduce semantic technologies at scale into our organization, which we call it the Roche Data Commons. And it's an abstraction model that in essence has 5 layers. So the first layer is infrastructure. This is where your data assets physically reside. Then we have a layer 2 where we manage our data assets. This is the cataloging level, if you wish, with also data transformation languages that we apply to transform data. For example, readouts from sequencing that where we have alignment algorithms. So data management happens here in data catalogs. And then the layer 3, this is the most important one. This is where we have the so-called harmonized data access points. And this is exactly where we move away from application-centric to information or data-centric. So we organize everything here around data. Here, for example, adverse events, clinical studies, biomarker, medical history, the patient sample, so that's the biospecimen, the study, and so on and so forth. And then in layer 4, we build our integrated data sets, and layer 5 is the layer where we build analytics and visualization tools. So really flipping the coin. I think people in classical IT organizations still very much think in terms of applications, not in terms of data or data products. But we put data at the center, which is managed from layer 1 to 3, and then you build applications on top of the data. So data stays, applications go away. So we try to get out of the vendor lock. And what holds all of this architecture, this abstraction together are the reference data, and the reference data come in terms of semantic resources for terminologies, metadata, dataset models, or ontologies. And I think the other point, which is a kind of a shift or a kind of a message that you have to send to your organization, that they really have to start to think that everything you have in your universe of discourse is a resource. So a file sitting on your infrastructure is a resource. A collection of files forming a data set on your infrastructure is a resource. The metadata, the data elements that you assign to describe your data assets, like creation date, creator, modified, these are resources. The values are resources, and also everything you expose here. And everything ideally should be rated with a uniform resource identifier, or more recently people call it GUPRIs, Global Unique Persistent Resource Identifiers. And the verification happens at layer 2 and 3. This is where we use the reference data, the semantic reference data to do the verification. And at layer 4 and 5, we then only use the URIs for dereferencing to understand the meaning of what we have used here to verify first. And as a result, we are able to really have completely transformationless workflows, which I cannot show today due to time, but we have, for example, a data set portal where the various data catalogs that sit underneath, which is about very, very diverse data, imaging data, proteomics data, biomarker data, study data. They expose their data with so-called fair data points, and we just natively read this into the dataset portal, nothing to do. I think this is a fantastic success story that illustrates the value of our data-centric approach and using systematically semantic technologies. Of course, looking into fairness, we have to look into 3 different layers. I think that fair is about data, but it's also about applications, and it's about our services. And I think this is where the FAIR principles come into play. Just for a quick refresher, so FAIR meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, has 2 flavors. One is a more the human flavor. That means that a scientist or a data consumer is able to find, access, and understand the data without the presence of the data owner. So you have all the data elements are shipped with the data to understand it. But more importantly, of course, for us is the ability for a machine to automatically find and use the data, to really make data actionable, not only readable, machine readable, but also machine actionable. Again, we are a part of a pre-competitive project in the Pistoia Alliance, where we have developed a so-called FAIR toolkit that has one chapter about fair maturity. And if you really want to understand true fair, what fair really means and how deep it goes into the way how you may want to implement a digital transformation, the fair maturity indicators, the fair metrics is very important. And as you also immediately see, is that fair goes into semantic resources. So FAIR is about data and metadata, but your data and your metadata, as mentioned before, everything is a resource, is assigned a separate global universal identifier, which is unique and persistent. And this also applies to your metadata. And ideally, you ground them in shared semantic vocabularies. To the same point, looking more into interoperability, your data and metadata use a formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. And in the FAIR strict, you have an ontology, a machine resolvable format, and also your vocabulary terms are fair and are machine readable. And this is exactly what we are doing in our organization. The issue is that looking into classical IT skill sets, this kind of semantic approach is not very close to typical IT profiles like business analysts, IT architects, or software engineers. However, if you wanted to make this transformation, you want to make this transformation fair and you want to make it data-driven, leveraging on semantics, we need to upskill them a little bit. And this is why we have written this fair architecture playbook, where you want to build our infrastructure or application data infrastructure fair by design that's supposed to support our key enablers, because they are the people who have to build and maintain the infrastructure. And again, this is just an example here coming out of the FAIR architecture playbook. We emphasize the importance of a global, persistent, and unique identifier. And last but not least, we also shed some light on what are the capabilities and the policies that you have to establish to be really fair and to leverage on all the wealth that we bring in from semantic technologies, like managing namespaces, registering them, having a repository for this, having policies how you create your globally unique, persistent, resolvable identifiers, policies, how you generate and mint your URIs. And last but not least, you've also seen this part of dereferencing and also bringing in fair resources. In the Roche Data Commons, you also have to have a way how you can resolve globally unique, persistent, and resolvable identifiers. So now looking into the capability stack, we at Roche, we have an in-house developed product line, which we call Scientific Interoperability Hub, that basically offers exactly the three products that I was mentioning before. We have terminology management. We have a semantic metadata registry that allows you to do a semantic dataset definition, kind of semantic schema definition. And last but not least, we have conceptual modeling, where we have our purpose-driven ontologies, leveraging on semantic languages, RDF, RDFS, and OWL, of course. Our products themselves are fair by design. Of course, we apply the principles to ourselves. Otherwise, it wouldn't be credible. And we really support verification at scale to the entire organization. And we ensure semantic interoperability and high data quality, but not only providing the technology and the platform, but also helping the various parts of the organization to adopt them. And our products serve as reference data for the various standards. And it also helps to link internal and external data assets for data acquisition and data integration. Those are very, very nice examples where our semantic descriptions can be used to provide semantic blueprints for data processing, data ingestion, data integration. And again, because everything is already fair from the beginning, we have fair machine actionable data manifesto, we can harmonize and standardize the entire workflow. And this also allows us to be faster, but we also have substantial savings in the way how we process our data with ways improved outcome. In terms of range, so we currently have more than 110 productive applications that we support across research, early development, technical operations, commercial, and our diagnostics division. And of course, we guarantee the currency and the ongoing support for the semantic resources that we generate. So having said this, if you look into our stack, going from terminology management over a semantic metadata registry, where we can also provide the semantic schemata and the conceptual modeling, all really being fully integrated, leveraging on community standards, being fair. The core intent is really that when you use this reference data and you systematically apply it in your data management value chain, then if you aggregate the data at layer 4 to create data marts, this comes more or less transformationless, and you have a significant, or at least you have a significant reduction in your integration efforts. And you are also faster, and last but not least, your insights are more reliable. So this is why this capability stack is very important. So having said this, this is just some screenshots of our 3 products. The first one, as mentioned before, is the terminology management, where here you can see on the left side the terminology navigator with indications that can or cannot be treated by drugs, or we have research on it. Here I've selected non-small cell lung cancer. And then we have a quite interesting approach. We have so-called named graphs as petitions in which we customize all the terminologies for the various applications. Epics, for example, is a global customer CRM system where we have our products related to indications and that are distributed in the various markets. And they are reusing here this non-small cell lung cancer in the context of an application terminology. And the concept has rich data like a preferred label, all the synonyms, a definition, cross-references, application references, and all the elements you would expect from a terminology management system. But this is really a very canonical data type, and we're using, of course, COS6L, doubling core, Provo to describe the elements that you can see here on the screen. Next level, where we have our data dictionaries for the semantic meta data element registry and our dataset models. What you can see here on the left side is where we manage and govern all the key elements that you can use to describe data sets or data schemata. Here there are the variables, for example, for describing a patient. And then this is a harmonized data access point for subjects. You have also seen it before on the slides for the Roche Data Commons. In the DM domain, the demographics domains, to describe the patient, you can now really assemble all the elements, but they are fully governed on the left side, and describe your domain. And the outcome of this is that whenever you use something like country or age or race or biological sex in a model, it will always refer to the same resource, to the same URI. So this is really building in interoperability from the very beginning. And then, of course, you have a little bit more metadata around the elements. So here you can also say, for my variable metadata element, data element country, the value domain is an application terminology, which comes in terms of a code list with alpha, ISO 3 alpha codes. It's single valued and it's a required variable. Last level is our reference model. Again, the same principle on the left side. We have a so-called model navigator. And in there, we really govern all the elements that you can use to describe a model in our world. So when you think about concepts like a drug or a tissue or a cell, they are globally managed. But when you build your purpose-driven conceptual model, you are obliged to pick them from the officially approved set of resources, and they will always have the same URI. So when I use disease as a concept, as a class, or cell as a concept or a class, in different models across different data domains, then it will always have the same URI. And this actually means that also this approach is very, very well suited to support data mesh architectures, because the different data domains are quite, say, independent, decoupled from each other. But whenever different data domains make use of the same class or the same property, they will have the same URI, and you can bring everything together. You will ask yourself, why are we so crazy not to use Protege or Top-Rate Composer? The issue is really, or the point here is really governance, so that we really have the set of highly governed, well-defined, high-quality classes and properties that we can use to define our models. And of course, we can export everything here in RDF OWL. Here you have, for example, the screenshot with the study definition, and you have all the properties with cardinality constraints and everything. But we use this not for modeling, we only use it for validation and for running classifiers to detect inconsistencies. So
there was a question, Martin, in the audience, if you want to take that now or if you'd like to wait, up to you.
Yeah. That's a very interesting one. Maybe I'm very close to the end of the presentation, so maybe I can pick this up at the end if it's okay for you.
Very good.
Yeah. So I just would like to position the capabilities we are having also in more classical IT approaches where you distinguish between a conceptual model, a logical model, and a physical model. So the conceptual modeling, as you have seen last, sits of course here at this layer. The dataset modeling is more at the logical level. At the physical, this is where we bring in the terminologies. So you really cover a classical architecture step that you would apply in IT with full-blown, fair semantic resources from terminologies over metadata schema into highly engineered ontologies. In order to run this, you have to provide a couple of services to the business, and this is, I also think, what's quite important. So we spend about 15% of our team resources on really maintaining and engineering the platform that I've shown to you. And the rest really goes into setting up these custom tailored terminologies, dataset models, and ontologies to support verification at scale. As I mentioned before, once these systems are born, we also ensure the maintenance and enhancement of standards. We try to align between data domains and subdomains to have shared semantics, shared models, provide technical support. And I think this fifth point is very, very important. It's about standards and data harmonization, which we really see as an industry effort. I mean, even between industry, there are some elements like, for example, countries and regions that we very likely all have. And it would be interesting to see how we can verify and semanticify if those. But we are part of a community that really tries to build this as an industry or community solution. We don't see this as a Roche property. So we participate actively in data standardization and data harmonization projects. Last but not least, we have a toolbox that helps people to work with our resources. Like, for example, we expose our terminologies as annotation text mining services. We have a FAIR API using JSON LD. Some people are more familiar with R, in particular data scientists. So we have wrappers around our endpoints, exposing them as R methods and services. We have a G-Sheet plugin that allows you to, if you have large tables, to map them against terminologies. This is a set of productivity tools. So coming to the conclusions. So at the heart of digitization and the heart of all the transformation we're working on and the mega trends, there is high quality, need for high quality standardized and linked data. Otherwise, I think we will fail on business insight generation, at least to have reliable. Fair principles and standardization intrinsically ties to semantic technologies. So if you really want to be fair, strict, you're using community vocabularies, you're using ontologies, then you have to have this capability in-house. Data-centric information procurement also supports transformationless data integration. I think we have very, very good use cases how this generates value and brings down expenses. And fair is also primarily about the how, not only about the that. I think many people take fair sometimes literally and say, oh, I can find my data, I'm fair. But finding data also means that you're finding data based on a concept that has a URI and not based on a string, because you will miss a lot of information. So in our data management value chain, we have to go down new architectural approaches supporting data-centricity. And this is really building on the interoperability of terminologies, metadata, dataset models, and ontologies. And I think as an industry, or also at the company level, of course, we really need to build these semantic capabilities that possibly one day will provide us the open public-private semantic infrastructure of fair application services and data we are looking into. And last but not least, I think most of our business, if not all, it's all about semantics. And with this, I would like to also acknowledge the colleagues from our team. And then I can start to pick up some for the questions. So thanks a lot for having me here, and thanks for your attention, and very pleased to pick up some questions.
Very good. So the first one in the chat was about these 5 ISO standards. Can you comment on the usage of those standards by the EMA FDA for IDMP compliance?
So I think that so far, the colleagues working in regulatory, they are more on tactical activities because they have to comply to regulatory requirements. However, with the venue of the needs of insights and also making data more transparent, they acknowledge that they have to work on, say, a semantic representation of these IDMP standards. So having said this, there is currently a project going on also under the umbrella of the before mentioned Pistoia Alliance, where we're developing an IDMP ontology that exactly would capture those points. We don't have it yet in-house because this is something that we don't want to do as a single company, but that's going to be inherent. It's going to be very, very, very relevant on the one hand for complying to regulatory, but so far the ISO standards are in PDF and we want to make them machine actionable, we want to make them reusable, we want to make them fair. And this is why the IDMP ontology will be a major milestone. I think it is available for download. If you want to take a look at the pistoialliance.org homepage, you might find more information there.
Good. Next one. How do you connect tabular data sets to their RDF descriptions?
Actually, I have 2 slides on those. I think there is there are 2 different approaches, right? I think when you have table-like structures and you translate them into a tabular representation, then typically we have a resource for an anchor element. Let's say, for example, a patient identifier. And as we already have an associated property with the column header, then we already have the property or the predicate. And then the harmonized value which sits in the cell is then becoming the object. So applying our technology stack would easily allow for translating a tabular representation of a data set into RDF. However, I think the issue here is that when you take a tabular representation and you do just this kind of tabular translation, you are missing sometimes the semantics between some of the properties. Let me give you one simple example. Let us assume we have a table. We describe a patient, and the patient in the table has an age value and an age unit. So when you translate the patient has age value 3 and age unit years, then you miss that age value and age unit together form another concept, which is age, right? And it gets more complex if you think about a treatment. It has a lot of administration, a dosage form, a strength, which is coming as a value unit pair. So what we are aiming at currently, and we're having some project, is to say, let's take tabular representations, but not simply just translate them into this simple triples where we have subject, column header, predicate, cell value, object, but rather map them on a rich knowledge graph with a model-driven transformation script. This is something we are working on. The next one is also quite a nice question. The top-level misalignments. I think this something we're also working with a lot of care. So I think you need to anchor your domain models in a top-level ontology like Buffo or Dolce or whatever you may want to select in your context. And indeed, I think when we build our reference classes, we already link them to the DFO so that they cannot be misused. Then you have the other issue that you have, as I mentioned before, you find also assay-related concepts in other ontologies. And then you have, of course, a constant issue. How do you map them? How do you align them? I think we definitely need to reduce the number of resources that we make available. I'm sometimes a little bit jealous of the finance industry that started from scratch and they created their own ontology, which they all now adopt. I think in our space, we definitely need to reduce a little bit the size of the knowledge base. So let me see.
Do you have internal tools for reconciliation of strings to entities, or do you use external tools like OpenRefine?
I think we follow a little bit the policy that we consider our infrastructure that I've shown to you as declarative systems. So systems where you have declarative knowledge. And what we want to do is we want to avoid that you have, for example, transformation rules in code or in transformation tools like if sex value F, then translate to female with the identifier. And this is why we are working with data transformation tools like OpenRefine, and we read in the schemata and the terminologies to do the mapping. So indeed, we provide these tools where you can have input strings like tables you can OpenRefine, and then you can, based on the input terminologies and some meta knowledge, you can map the strings to URIs. I think this is a very, very important part of data acquisition and data instantiation. Don't have a string-based representation of your data, have a URI-based representation, and we translate both the schema and the values in our tools. We have been experimenting with other tools. Some of you might know Tamer, for example. Also read in the terminologies in the schemata for data transformation. There are many others. I don't want to make publicity for any of those. They're all good.
Yep.
Yeah.
In your layer cake, at layer 4, there's no more transformation. Does that mean the data scientists are consuming RDF?
Well, that's a very good one. So actually, we have different flavors. It's also fair to say that when we were looking into this journey, we didn't start off so much with RDF. So our APIs are JSON, and more recently we have a lot of JSON LD endpoints also for our technology stack. And as all of you know, you can serialize JSON LD as RDF. I think the typical consumer is more not so semantic savvy. I think this is also an area where we are currently looking into really upskilling data scientists and our IT colleagues to be able to work with those. So having said this, we have some endpoints that are have a kind of a switch, which say they are either semantic or normal. So it means that you can read them as a normal JSON, or you can get them as a JSON LD with all the identifiers. I think as long as people can cope with say resources, identifiers for metadata, and also values, like you're shipping a URI for non-small cell lung cancer, or you'd have, for example, the indication coming as a URI. They are not necessarily bound to RDF, but of course, I think this would be a big advantage.
Yep. So Peter's was next, but he's got his hand up. Here, Peter, I'll let you speak. Okay, we should be able to hear you now.
Yeah, can you hear me? Is that working?
Yep.
Or? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I've sort of dabbled in this, let's say, because I worked on an IDMP project for GlaxoSmithKline vaccines here in 2017, and then we had to report for compliance to the European Medicines Agency, which was in a bit of a turmoil at the time because of Brexit. They had to move from London to Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And I guess this question for Martin is, you have this huge list of referentials, which are really a lot of lookup tables. I think there's 200 of them now. I sent the link. Anybody can go in there and take a look at them. So they talked about SPORE, which meant substances, products, organizations, and referentials. And I think only the organizations and referentials have been done. Substances is by far the most complex one, and the products are also relatively complex. And I'm just wondering how you could actually pull those into your environment or harvest them on a sort of as needed basis. Is that a clear question?
I think this is exactly something that we do at different levels. So I mean, as you said, we have currently a focus on the referentials. I've also to say that from a fair and a semantic perspective, I have some issues with the referentials. So you may know the URLs that they provide, or the URL that they provide, for example, for a country. And what they are doing is they are coding the code of the code list in the URL, and this gives you a lot of this cuts off flexibility, because in essence, in a very good semantic model, the membership in a code list would be something like as cost in scheme, right? So I think it's also very important to bring this notion of fairification and using fair vocabularies to all the various content providers, and that's a constant impediment. And I also agree that when it comes to the substances and the referentials, the products, it's still a work in progress, also based on the 5 ISO models you have mentioned before. I think that there's progress here, but there's still a lot of work to do, and also, there was quite some delay caused to the Brexit and the relocation of the EMAT from London to Amsterdam. Also would like to take the opportunity to greet my colleague Nolan. Good to have you in the call. Also picking up your question.
That one's up next.
I think that, as you say, most data scientists don't use Sparkle. I would also say that in our world, we try to prevent them from using Sparkle. The reason again here is governance. So let us assume, for example, you create a very, very nice code list for indications, and then if your system is too open, then people would just create a local copy, walk away, and they would eventually create a clone somewhere. And if one day, for example, you add new synonyms or you're changing your taxonomy or whatsoever, you don't know where your data has gone, right? So ideally, we say, okay, there is an endpoint. We currently have a JSON LD endpoint that provides you RDF, and you can use this JSON LD to fetch the most recent version of your data. If you're not a data scientist, if you don't like RDF, you can still read it as normal JSON. If you're savvy in our domains, you know about COSXL and everything, then you can fully leverage it. Ideally, that's a little bit also on the layer 4. The idea is that if we have more and more semantically aligned Sparkle endpoints, RDF, JSON LD endpoints exposing the semantics, then you can really read in the data from different endpoints, and you would just create your semantic data mart, your knowledge graph, more or less organically without having to work on transformations. So the preferred way of consumption is actually using the API, just not to lose the momentum with governance.
One more here. To be able to keep standards throughout a large organization must be challenging. How do you go about it?
That's possibly the hardest part. I mean, I think we were lucky if we had one standard and we could just go about it. That's possibly the biggest challenge. Like, this is a universe that you only partially own and that you can only partially control. So you really have to be very, very much up to date. And I think that's possibly the fifth point that I said. It's very close to our heart. And I really have to say, we really have to fight the proliferation of standards. I have so many examples that really show that if interoperability is key, we need to say, if I have, for example, a property, for example, for the biological sex, ideally all standard issuing organizations should use the URI for this property. Otherwise, we are back to the ETL and map and merge business. Just maybe a last question to the EOC, the European Open Science Cloud. Just had a meeting with them in November. I was invited here as a keynote speaker, which was very interesting. It was the first meeting in my life, 400 people. I didn't know anybody, never happened to me before. I think this is a very, very interesting resource that you should monitor. And it really goes into the entire question, how as a community with all this diversity of players and interests, how do we manage our knowledge base in a way that it stays tractable? And again, this is only possible if we have fair standards. And if we want to have fair standards, we have to go into the arts of semantics.
Okay, Steve, I know we're a couple minutes over. Do you want to take a few more kind of raised hands here? Or do you want to sort of move along?
Yeah, I have a question of my own here, Martin, and it's a little bit two-part. But how do you ensure good and consistent ontology? And the second part of that is I know you brought up this term called data sprints, and it'd be interesting for our community to hear a little bit more about what that involves and what the impact is there.
Yeah. I think possibly maintaining good and high quality ontologies is the largest issue. I think on our side, this is again, the key is again governance. And I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization with all this vivid ontology community across the world. And whenever you have a kind of an ontological problem, you always find literature and people who have already solved it. But then how do you distill the essence out of this, and how do you get this into your own organization? So we have also we have guidelines that are written internally. We have naming conventions. We have data governance processes. And the thing that we can possibly say manage most is then how do we adopt this in our data domains and subdomains. And the other part, I think this is a key success factor, is that given the complexity and the diversity of the product that we're having, that we want to get into business, it is not a golden path that you walk along. You have to be constantly working with the various stakeholders from all the different areas, commercial, manufacturing. And this is why we have this notion of a data sprint, which is a Scrum-like approach. That means that all the requests that are coming in, either from the business or all the adoptions we have to do because standard changes, we bring them into our say backlog, and we constantly work with them to be, on the one hand, current and also harmonizing standards, but also being very, very close on the business. And I have to say, this is possibly the most important piece, that you build trust in the organization. And initially, people are a little bit reluctant to work on this kind of approach. But when they see that we as teams maintaining semantic standards, we are not here to create an additional pain point, we are here to help them, then they are fully on board. And this is also something that energizes me every day, to get the strong buy-in from all the various functions after this initial, learning curve, and say, okay, hey, these guys with their approaches, with their semantic capabilities, and also their support on standardization curation, they really help us in our business.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Let's put, what is it? Pirlagi, let's put you on the stage, and that'll be our last question, and then we'll have to move on to our next session.
Okay. I think we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. I just I'm curious if you could relate some stories. I was tempted to put the question in terms of metrics, but sort of the thing that I would be interested in is what do you see? What other people outside of the kind of data value community at Roche are seeing in terms of benefits? What are the greatest perceived benefits for other businesses, or what do they like and what do they gain?
I think that possibly the most important piece is really the value proposition you're making. And I think there are these three key elements, is that you can really reduce the expenses to work with data assets to a significant part, also enhancing data quality. The second one is speed. So for example, internalizing CRO data about studies is something that we can process instantaneously. And I think the highest value proposition is really to create better, more reliable, more trustful insights, and also having a higher throughput in the insight generation business. It's also, I think also have to mention, it's as I think also Steve mentioned this in the introduction, right? It's not like this battle is won and it's a golden path that we walk along. Still, depending on the maturity of various parts of the organization, the understanding, the willingness to change, to adopt, we still have a lot of space to convincing people better. But being in this area now for, as mentioned initially, for 3 decades, I see really a substantial change where semantic people, we were kind of niche, exotic people, right? And now there's an understanding that semantic technologies belong in the portfolio of an IT organization, and they are really in the heart of having decent data management in our data management value chain. I hope I could answer your question.
Well, unfortunately, Martin, we've run out of time. So thank you so much again for taking some time out and joining us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.